The kind of mythology that you always heard in the 50s and 60s was that, if you smoked pot, that would lead to heroin. But in fact, what it did lead to was really LSD. That psychedelic journey was available to you. The journey was a journey of the imagination. It wasn't an escape. It was, well, a trip.
Three drops of this colorless, odorless, tasteless liquid would put you out of your mind for hours, out of your normal mind into kinds of consciousness so fantastic, so self-revealing, so charged with emotion, that usually the first dose is the most profound experience in a lifetime, and sometimes the most shattering. This can be psychological dynamite.
Why would people do it? Because it's fun, because it's exciting, because it was dangerous, because your parents didn't want to do it, and because it was the new.
I took it the first time because I was curious.
Under LSD, God's not a faraway idea. He's something that's right inside you that you're experiencing now.
Because it really changed my whole life. I mean, it was the most fantastic thing that has ever happened to me.
LSD was first invented by Albert Hofmann, a Swiss chemist, in 1938. And in 1943, he had a peculiar presentiment that something about that molecule deserved another look.
He was trying to find a treatment of migraines, so he ingested some, and when he really started feeling the effects of it, he got on his bike and he went riding off into the Swiss countryside for the first LSD trip in history. There were two interpretations of the meaning of LSD. The first came from the psychiatric community.
Back in the 50s and 60s, there was a large body of research, and tens of thousands of people underwent LSD psychotherapy with some good effects. And interesting patient populations, I mean, childhood autism and schizophrenia, certainly alcoholism and drug addiction.
Other people were aware that LSD could be stimulating creativity. And so there were a group of scientists that were doing low-dose LSD every once in a while and then working on intellectual problems. And Francis Crick was one of them. And it turns out that the day he had the vision of the double helix in 1953, one of the most important scientific discoveries of the 20th century, the structure of DNA, was one of the days that he was experimenting with LSD.
The other interpretation and agenda was that what this stuff is insane.
It can produce suicide attempts, homicide attempts, appalling panic. It's a virtually indescribable panic that may last for a period of days or even weeks.
And that is precisely what attracted the spooks of the CIA.
Here is a group of normal soldiers responding to a series of routine drill commands. After receiving a small dose of LSD, they are confused and undisciplined.
At a certain point, the U.S. government became alarmed and thought that LSD was going to enable the Russians to come up with a truth serum, or that they would be able to use it as a weapon. So in the early 50s, the Central Intelligence Agency started a research program called MKUltra, looking into chemical weapons, biological weapons, and other kinds of unconventional weaponry. As part of this LSD experimentation, they would go into bars and they would squirt it into people's drinks, and then they would bring them back to a so-called safe house where they had one-way mirrors, and they would be behind that mirror making notes about how these people responded.
Reaper! You know what day it is today, Cap? Yeah. What? What day of the week? Wait a minute.
Around the time that the CIA is doing their mind control experiments, Timothy Leary was the faculty sponsor of research with psilocybin at Harvard.
Psilocybin was the synthetic extract of the psychoactive molecule magic mushrooms. And in the early 1960s at Harvard, Timothy Leary, this tweedy professor, started gathering these bright young scholars around him, and they began taking the substance.
The effect is somewhat like looking through a microscope. Suddenly, you discover that there's an invisible world around you that you hadn't known about before you did it. The same thing is true with a psychedelic drug. You're aware of processes that are going on inside your own brain.
Leary and his colleagues believed that psilocybin was revolutionary and that it could really remake human thought and society.
The doctors wouldn't like that because it would be throwing their game of medicine into dramatic revision. The ministers and priests wouldn't like it because there's a new conception of the divine process that's not in the Bible.
And suddenly the media had discovered this really interesting story. Students and teachers taking these wild, mind-altering drugs together, and it was very controversial.
Our aim, like the aims of any religious group just beginning, is to transform American society. It's an insane asylum over here, and it's our goal to lift the spiritual level of the American people. We're going to try to bring about a religious renaissance and a spiritual revolution.
Tim Leary sort of wanted everyone to have it, and he, to a large extent, was personally responsible for introducing psychedelics to, America at large.
I have to say, maybe I wouldn't have taken LSD if I hadn't have read his literature about it. He gave me some of the intellectual grounding to feel safe about it. Certainly among everyone I knew, there was a deep spiritual curiosity, and most people took their LSD trips seriously. And certainly those first couple of trips are mind-blowing. Suddenly you're seeing the effect of raw, unfiltered information coming in.
A lot of people were caught off guard by how powerful their LSD experiences were, both positive and negative, difficult and easy.
It's like playing with a shotgun, and personally, I don't want to die.
You'd completely lost all sense of being, and the only thing that you were conscious of was the barrage of the senses, the feeling of the brain with all the nerves sending barrages of experience into your brain and the nerves going into the neck, and how the nicest thing that you could possibly think of would be to cut those nerves off, to cut off that experience, to die. It was 50-50. Half of it was very nice.
The motto of our religion and what we are advising all Americans is turn on, tune in, and drop out. Now this may sound rather shocking. Actually, this is the oldest religious metaphor and statement which teachers have passed on for thousands of years.
Tim Leary truly believed that these drugs could bring about a more direct access to the Godhead. At the same time, on the West Coast, you have this character, Ken Kesey, and he begins pursuing what is essentially the recreational sports approach to the psychedelic experience.
I've always thought that this is one of those things that proves that God has a sense of humor. That if Gabriel come up and says, hey, Chief, the Americans are really messed up down there. We're going to have to do something to straighten them out. They've got a nosedive karma going on. And God says, well, send them some of that stuff you've been working on, that acid stuff, and have the CIA distribute it. You can hear the celestial laughter.
Ken Kesey was a writer, and he was a student at Stanford, and he was part of experiments at the VA hospital there. For money, they could take these experimental drugs, including LSD.
And my metaphor for the thing was, it's as though these people had discovered a room, and they thought there was something in that room of value to them, but they didn't want to go in there. So they hired students to go in there, and after a number of those students came out with a wild look in their eye, they said, close up that room and don't let anybody else go back in that room. And that's when I found that my key fit the doctor's office and decided that this was too important a business to leave in the hands of the government.
It didn't take him long to figure out how to get his hands on it, and he got himself a job working the night shift at a psychiatric facility, and he would actually take the stuff during the night shift. That was where he got the idea for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. For him, being on this psychiatric ward under the effects of these chemicals was like someone ripping the veil away to peer into the darkness at the heart of the American soul. Kesey is essentially looking at American society as a loony bin.
Here was this tremendous work of art that was written partially under the influence of LSD and captured a lot of people's feelings about the spirit of the age and the need for this breakthrough through the freedom-loving spirit. And I think Ken was able, through that literature, to just motivate a lot of people. And personally, I'd say motivated me to try psychedelics.
The significant thing about Kesey, I think, is that the psychedelic experience really becomes, first and foremost, an adventure.
Ken Kesey, in the story told by Tom Wolfe in the electric Kool-Aid acid test, gathered his friends in a group that they called the Merry Pranksters, and as much LSD as they could put together, got in a bus that they called Further, and drove across the country experiencing America on acid.
This is the captain speaking. We are cruising at an altitude of 38,000 feet. Oxygen will not be necessary in the pressurized cabin.
To say that they were merely stoned would do a tremendous disservice to how stoned they really were.
Being assailed by a swarm of joints. So I'm trying to keep them flowing toward the front of the bus. Well, can't push them beside.
Oh, yes, we are.
So I want to take some LSD. I want Babs to take some. Cassidy, you want to take some?
There was a kind of antic, surreal, fun quality to being these kind of psychedelic pranksters. It became a big joke on straight culture.
Sleep all day, drive all night. Brain my numb, can't stop now. For sure ain't no doubt. Keep an open mind, let it all hang out.
When they were all high and they were all plugged in, it seemed like the bus became this one consciousness through space and light and time, and that was what they called group mind. And that was very much the concept that they were going after when they got back from the bus trip and they decided to begin the acid tests. Suddenly, these leaflets started appearing up and down the coast around the Bay Area with these cryptic words, "Can you pass the acid test?" And what the acid tests were was the first multimedia mass acid experience.
During the time that Kesey was experimenting with it, LSD was manufactured as a legal drug. So he became sort of the Pied Piper to the psychedelic culture that was growing up in the San Francisco area at that time.
The commencement exercises for LSDU will be held at Winterland on Monday night. That's Halloween. And, of course, the man who is going to be passing out the diplomas is Ken Kesey.
I knew that people were tired of the old concert form, and the acid test was, again, discovering what there was out there if you just continued to move away from the norm.
Are you going to tell what's bad about LSD?
Not necessarily.
Will LSD be
evidence at the graduation ceremony, Captain? Why don't you guys come?
Yeah.
Some of that